Nearly 1 in 4 DC households are in utility debt. Over 26,000 disconnection notices to DC residents in April 2025 alone. Pepco was forced to pay out $57 million for, quote, routinely discharging hazardous chemicals into soil, groundwater, and storm sewers, fouling the Anacostia River for decades. Rate reductions of anywhere from 10 to 20% if you pursue municipalization. We believe that our electricity system should work for the public, not for profit. Great. Okay, sweet. Hi, everyone. My name is Bethany. I am a co-chair of We Power DC, which is DC's campaign for a public power utility here in the district. We are really excited to welcome you here after many months of putting together this white paper that we have produced. It was absolutely a labor of love and also of hate of Pepco, as you might imagine. So we were really excited to share our findings with you. We've really been digging deep in the e-docket, going through those Public Service Commission records. And we're really excited to share basically the case for why Pepco is not serving us as our utility and how a public utility could do it better. So we can go ahead and jump right in. So first of all, what is We Power? So We Power DC is a coalition of community members and organizations that are advocating for a public utility here in the district. We believe that our electricity system should work for the public, not for profit. You also notice we are going to be specifically focusing on electricity utilities for right now. Maybe someday we get really ambitious and we start tackling Washington Gas as well, but for right now we're talking about Pepco primarily. And don't worry, we also support a lot of other coalition building around gas issues, but municipalization of Pepco is what we're going for right now. A public power utility, generally speaking, would keep rates more affordable. It would be much more accountable to our climate goals as a district that we have already made very clear through legislation. It remains much more transparent and community controlled than Pepco could ever be. And it also protects DC residents from shutoffs and debt, which is a very acute issue here in the district. So this slide is very scary looking, I'm sorry. But to be honest, the situation is scary and weird. So I feel like it's an accurate representation. So in the middle, you can see Pepco, an excellent company. This is our investor-owned utility here in the district. And so Pepco is the one that is distributing electricity to your house wherever you live, as long as you're in DC, and then also bills DC residents. When DC residents are paying those rates, they're paying their bills back to Pepco, and then Pepco is sending their profit off to far-off shareholders. They are a subsidiary company of Exelon, which is a Chicago-based company that doesn't really care about us here. And then those shareholders are taking a cut. So basically, when we are paying our rates here, it's not getting reinvested back in our community. It's not, helping our neighbors. It's not furthering our electricity and renewable energy goals. It is just going towards shareholders. How do we combat that? In the past, the idea has been that we could have a public service commission that's really going to regulate this investor-owned utility to keep it in line, to make sure that it's serving the public. And we do have that system currently. So that is our Public Service Commission. They are the governmental agency. There are 3 commissioners who oversee Pepco and they regulate Pepco. So they are the ones that set the rates. Pepco has to go to them when they want to spend more of DC's money. But what we found is just they are not doing their jobs well enough. They have continued to defer to Pepco on many different cases. For one thing, we've all seen crazy increases in our bills this very summer, and the Public Service Commission is the entity that allowed that. So we are really just finding that they are not doing their jobs well enough, and that this sort of reform model is just not good enough. And so we think that we could do something better. To talk more acutely about the actual crisis that is happening here in DC right now, nearly 1 in 4 DC households are in utility debt. So if you think about that, that's almost 25% of your neighbors here in the district that cannot pay their utility bills on time. And what does that result in? It means that DC residents hold over $32 million of utility debt across the whole city, which is just how is anybody supposed to pay that back? This is a hole that we're going to keep on digging. And Pepco sends over 26,000 disconnection notices to DC residents in April 2025 alone. So that is a very real, acute problem that our community is facing, where people are not able to pay their utility bills, and then they're also being threatened with having their lights shut off. This is a really serious issue for a lot of people, especially people that need electricity for their medical needs, if they have medication that needs to be refrigerated, if they have medical devices they need to be connected to, but is even so just like an inconvenience for the average person. And additionally, like the unaffordable rates are a problem for all of us. And so we really think that this is an unnecessary crisis. We know that there is something better, and that's what we're here to talk about. So what do we want? We believe in a public power utility. So you might also hear that known as a municipal utility. We kind of use those two things interchangeably. In the industry, they can be known as munis, which I think is a really adorable name. And so what that would look like here in DC, this is a very high level diagram. This is, we're not getting into the nitty gritty here, but basically DC would be still distributing the electricity and billing DC residents. But then once DC residents are paying their bills, that money is getting redistributed back into our community. So there's no outside money that is getting thrown off to shareholders. There's no one else taking a cut. All of that it's a very circular process, and there's much more governance and oversight. And so DC residents would be directly involved in the governance structure, which could look like a lot of different things that we can get into further down the line. But basically, the big point here is that there's no far off Exelon who's getting their cut. Instead, our rates are going back into our community, and there's no further incentives to jack up rates and just like squeeze dollars from our communities. And this exists already. This is not a new novel concept. The public power model is actually one of the original models of electricity distribution in the United States, going back to the early 1900s. And currently today, it serves over 54 million Americans across the country. We know that this is tried and true. You'll see public utilities in big cities like LA and Seattle. So this isn't only something that is reserved for small towns. We know that big cities can do it too. And the big thing is also that utility bills can be up to 13% lower on average across investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities. So that is a huge difference just based on the model, not even comparing like additional benefits of renewable energy programs that and like labor benefits that we deserve here in the district. So yeah, this is sort of the model that we're thinking about. And next slide. So like I said at the beginning, we have been spending the past basically year putting together all of these thoughts much more in depth into this white paper. So we are talking about the failures of the investor-owned utility model and the public power alternative in Washington, D.C. This white paper is available to read now on our website, which we're very excited about, and we're excited to dig into some of the details with you right now. So the paper basically lays out the key functions of a utility and the ways that Pepco is not doing that, and they're just generally failing at their jobs. And then additionally, it talks about the improvements that we could see under a public power utility and also our recommendations for sort of next steps in this process of municipalization. Now I'll pass it off to Sarah.
Thank you, Bethany. So I'm Sarah. I'm with WePower for a few months now. I'm going to go over function one, the access and affordability part of the white paper. Bethany already kind of touched on some of the data points, so I'll just kind of go over more of the high level for this one. So how does the investor-owned utility model that Pepco uses hamper energy access and affordability? So the bottom line is that Pepco's rates keep increasing and DC's residents can't keep up with the high electricity rates. And this leads to electricity shutoffs for residents living in DC. So why do Pepco's rates keep increasing? So looking at the bigger picture here, the investor-owned utility model that Pepco uses has the company prioritizing the needs of shareholders over ratepayers. To appease Pepco's shareholders, Pepco basically needs to be maximizing profits at all times. That's like their main mission. So then this translates to raising rates as high as the Public Service Commission will allow. So this often pushes many ratepayers into debt in the district. How would a public utility make access and affordability better overall? So public power customers will pay less for service on average because they don't have to line shareholders' pockets like you do with an investor-owned utility model, and residential customers won't be thrown into debt as often since rates will be more affordable. Residents won't have their power shut off on them for not being able to afford their electricity. The next key function of utility that we're going to talk about is raising capital. How does Pepco raise the capital that they need to appease shareholders? So utilities in general, they often raise the capital needed to make infrastructure investments by taking on debt and selling equity in the utility. So keeping this in mind, let's kind of start with the graphic sequence at the bottom of the slide to kind of ground us a bit in Pepco's process. So starting on the left, the cycle begins with Pepco shareholders demanding a high rate of return on Pepco's investments. We go over to the right. Pepco then lobbies the Public Service Commission for higher shareholder returns. On to the next one. From there, the Public Service Commission grants the increase, leading to Pepco increasing their rates to pay out the new returns. And then as a result, Pepco increases the rates for their customers. So ultimately, Pepco's use of equity finance requires extremely high return on equity for shareholders. And this leads to expensive capital costs for investments overall. So successful lobbying for a high rate of return thus means more profits for Pepco in the long term, and also translates just to higher electricity costs for customers. Looking at the graphics on the top of the slide, Pepco's rate of return was 9.5 in 2024, meaning that Pepco paid over $200 million of its net income to debt holders and shareholders last year. In 2024, though, publicly owned utilities, their bond rate was 4%. And this is much less expensive overall. So that if we had like a public utility model set up at that time, I think that would have been 120 million sent to bondholders versus 230 million. So that's well over $100 million worth of savings just on that alone, just based on the type of financing that you're using. So how would a municipal utility do this better overall? A municipal utility wouldn't need to pay out massive amounts of money to shareholders. There's not that incentive under this type of model. And it would have the flexibility of accessing cheaper financing solutions, which would lead to lower rates for residents. So next, go into grid planning. Grid planning is going to be a bit more, it's kind of technical, but I'm going to try to make it as easy to digest as possible. So there are three main kind of takeaways within the grid planning section of the white paper. The first kind of key finding is that Pepco uses overstated cost forecasts for investments to increase revenue requirements, which leads to higher electricity prices. The second finding is that Pepco masks expensive traditional investments as climate friendly or for grid modernization to avoid cheaper solutions like distributed energy resources or like non-wires alternatives, which ultimately increases costs for residents and subverts climate goals at the same time, like Bethany had said earlier. And then the third kind of main takeaway for the grid planning section of the white paper is that Pepco ignores the negative externalities of investment planning, such as like environmental, health, social costs that come with the types of alternatives that they choose whenever they do their grid planning. And this disproportionately affects minority and disinvested communities, and ultimately just leads to a lack of accountability to DC communities overall. So the first kind of takeaway, I'm just going to kind of go back to that. That's about the overstated cost forecasts section. So how does Pepco do their cost forecasting, you might ask? So they use very opaque modeling overall. In past plans, they've used what's called like a fixed cost calculator. And this pretty much just bases costs off of past investments. So they have like older receipts to share. It's slightly less opaque, but still kind of, iffy. But what they recently have been using is called company specific cost forecasting. So it's basically Pepco going to the Public Service Commission, telling them what they want, and then saying, like, trust me on this, like there's no like, receipts involved. There's not, they can basically overstate what they need. So with this type of forecasting, Pepco has the incentive to overstate the costs for their grid planning projects. And this ultimately maximizes revenues for them and just ultimately leads to higher prices for DC residents. Another interesting finding from the white paper that I just kind of wanted to bring up quickly is that in general, Pepco likes to argue that they need more capacity to meet their electrification needs in DC. But a recent study by the Department of Energy and Environment, they recently conducted a study on the impacts of energy efficiency, building electrification, EV rollout on the city's electricity usage. And this study said that through 2032, combined electrification loads will not exceed substation capacity in any zone. And what that means basically is that there's enough power capacity in DC. Pepco is lying about the need for more energy to justify expensive investments to enrich their shareholders. We have enough energy, like, so that's kind of the main takeaway. So the next kind of like major focus is the fact that Pepco masks expensive traditional investments as climate friendly and for grid modernization in order to avoid using cheaper solutions such as like batteries, like rooftop solar, microgrids, all that stuff, which ultimately leads to cost increase for residents and subverts climate goals. So in general, utilities make decisions as to how to invest in a city's power infrastructure. It often includes like the physical types of infrastructure like substations, transformers. Could also just, it's like most of the time it's just like wires, alternatives. And then also like non-physical infrastructure like software, cybersecurity stuff. And then they also tend to, they make decisions about processes for onboarding clean energy or like energy efficiency assets and considering like non-energy impacts. So in Pepco's context, their goal is to prioritize shareholders. So how does Pepco do their grid planning? Just kind of, keeping this like core utilities function in mind. So Pepco intentionally plans unnecessary, expensive wire infrastructure investments so they can justify raising electricity prices on DC residents so that their shareholders can achieve certain profit margins. Essentially, like an example would be they might like want to invest in like a substation replacement project in the building of like a new transmission line. This is usually very expensive projects overall, and these projects often rely on like really dirty types of energy, and it's just it just makes it more expensive to operate the grid overall when they could be prioritizing like cleaner, cheaper solutions. So like oftentimes these projects aren't really needed. It's just a way for Pepco to line their shareholders' pockets. And then I think just kind of like on like the non-wires alternative. So that's kind of your stuff like rooftop solar, battery energy storage systems with microgrids. They can increase the capacity of a utilities distribution system, either by managing demand or generating power closer to the end user without the extra expensive wires investment. So there's other ways of managing power demand and all that stuff. And like just these, really expensive and dirty alternatives that Pepco uses are not necessary whatsoever. And shareholders are benefiting from the prints and profits, incentivize profit, and DC residents are still stuck with the bill. So like the last kind of key point for grid planning, just wanted to kind of like mention that negative externalities that Pepco ignores in its grid planning process. So investor-owned utilities like Pepco are, in general, they're required to develop programming with community feedback included, but they tend to only pay attention to negative externalities when they're forced to by court order. So for example, in 2023, one thing that the white paper kind of talks about is that Pepco was forced to pay out $57 million for, quote, routinely discharging hazardous chemicals into soil, groundwater, and storm sewers, which ended up fouling the Anacostia River for decades, and it was the largest environmental settlement in DC history. So overall, public power would not have like this incentive to dump hazardous chemicals into waterways because it would be choosing other cleaner alternatives that have minimal environmental impacts because we're beholden to community members and not to shareholders. And the planning process overall would include planning for potential environmental impacts like really early on in the planning process, and it would be like continuously monitoring like for those bad impacts, right? So then overall, lots of Pepco's planning processes take place behind the scenes with minimal public knowledge, and a publicly owned utility would not be doing that at all. Public power tends to be more effective at meeting community needs. It usually helps like greater percentages of low income and minority households, and just tends to receive better customer feedback as well. And then I just kind of wanted to highlights this interesting graphic. Just kind of the overall point of this is this DC residents pay Pepco for investments that never materialized. Under a publicly owned utility model, this would not happen. Any extra savings would be reinvested into the utility, and not just in some rando guys pockets in Chicago, right? So yeah, so overall, how could public power do grid planning better? Publicly owned utilities do not have the same incentives to invest in dirty energy and expensive alternatives. And investing in cheaper non-wires alternatives like batteries, microgrids, virtual power plants, all of those cool alternatives will save ratepayers money, and they'll improve environmental and health outcomes, since residents are going to be at the forefront of the planning processes and not to shareholder interests. We know our own needs, and we can have our own needs like reflected in these grid planning initiatives with a publicly owned utility while meeting DC's climate goals.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, the grid planning piece of this is very intense and important. And so we're glad that you were able to give it a deep dive. And if you want more information, read the paper. A lot of this plays into function number 4, which is power procurement. And so basically, as Sarah was mentioning, like Pepco's incentive structures are broken in the sense that they don't have any incentive to allow distributed energy resources, these things like solar, wind, batteries, and storage onto the grid. And so because they want to continue to invest in their own capital infrastructure projects. And so how that manifests is that they slow it down. They don't update something called a hosting capacity map, which would basically show across DC like where fast and easy places would be to build out more renewables. They also delay interconnection. So in the energy space, interconnection is a very hot topic. It's constantly being discussed. And one of the big reasons is because it can take ages for a fully constructed project to be allowed to connect to the grid. And that is something that the utility has a lot of control over, and Pepco has no incentive to do that process quickly. And it's a very opaque process, like you're hearing about a lot of this. So it's really easy for them to say, sorry guys, like it just takes that long. But we know that it doesn't. We know that a municipal utility could prioritize this process, because also distributed energy resources are a huge part of energy sovereignty and energy democracy, where individual consumers and energy users across DC should be able to make these choices for themselves, not just at the whole utility scale level. And so this process is really important. And they also don't have transparency on interconnection costs. So not only might it take a really long time, but it also might be really expensive. There are a lot of fees associated with interconnection. And so people who are trying to do these distributed energy resource projects, these solar projects across DC, might get sat with like huge fees at the end that they didn't even realize. And it's really hard for developers to like build in those costs ahead of time to be able to convey that to their customers. Additionally, energy efficiency, like again, is just the incentives are broken. We know that Pepco doesn't have any incentive to encourage customers to do energy efficiency projects, because while it might save them money on like the customers money on their bills, Pepco wants maximum energy demand so they can continue to build out that capital infrastructure. And so they have lobbied to get something called a bill stabilization adjustment, which basically is just a fee that we are all paying so that Pepco continue to get its guaranteed rate of return for its shareholders, even as we continue to improve our energy efficiency across the district. Our bills are not going down. And so it's really just a ridiculous, like, you can get so in the weeds on it. You can tell that I'm like excited, right? So like, let me at them. But basically we know that like a municipal utility, public power, doesn't have these broken incentive structures. Public power wants people to reduce their bills. It wants to reinvest this money back into their community. It wants people to be able to make what choice is best for their household in terms of energy efficiency and renewable energy. And that's what we're trying to do. And then the last piece is employment. As you may recall, this campaign is in partnership with the Democratic Socialists of America. So obviously labor is a huge important piece of this. And we know that Pepco is, on top of everything else, also not that great of an employer. We have statistics that show that Pepco has been replacing union jobs with cheap, expendable contracted labor, and that there have actually been multiple incidents of problems happening out on DC's grid that were done by contractors where they were either underinformed or they didn't have all the resources that they need, and then full-time staff had to go back and fix it later. So it's, once again, it's another inefficiency where also the staff isn't being treated well, where they're not getting paid even as much as minimum wage here in DC because they're contracted labor. And additionally, they're not receiving health care or benefits. And so a municipal public power utility could do a lot of these things better because it is, again, incentivized to work for the community. Additionally, one of the things that will come up a lot is that public power would mean that some of these employees could be considered public employees, which might reduce their ability to strike. And that is a huge issue in labor conversations about public power, but it is also one that we are finding creative solutions for. So for example, the Long Island Power Authority has a public-private partnership where the staff are maintained under this private contract that is contracted to the public power utility, which allows them to maintain their right to strike and also has allowed them to maintain their pensions. And so both of these things are really important, and it's one of the reasons that we want to be talking to members of local labor unions as early as we possibly can so that we can work out the best way forward with them. So what do we do about all this? It's a lot. We've made the case. We know Pepco sucks. I think a lot of you came in here knowing that today. And so what are the next steps? Municipalization is a process. And so one of the first things that we want to see the DC Council do is conduct a robust municipalization feasibility study. This feasibility study really tells a tale of how much would it cost, for one thing, to take over Pepco, for the DC government to basically buy out that infrastructure. But then also, like, what are other considerations that we would need to make? What would the timeline be? What are the legal barriers that we have? In the past, DC did conduct what was originally supposed to be a feasibility study and then got watered down into basically becoming a landscape analysis of what municipalization has looked like in other places. And so we did get a report out of that, and it shows us these 4 steps. So we can at least say, DC government, like, you told us this. We know that this is the process of first investigation. That's the feasibility study. And then it's also acquisition, actually buying these things out from Pepco, transitioning to a new governance structure that we would all have to design, and then also like actually bringing it to fruition. What would it look like to actually run this thing? And so we're really excited to see what these process and what these steps would look like with a robust feasibility study. But that feasibility study is only one piece of the puzzle, because while that would tell us the tale to how we could get to municipalization long term, we also know that we need to regain power from Pepco right now. And so our other recommendations, numbers 2 through 5 here, you can see are things that we would be doing in the shorter term that would help us improve the customer experience and take power away from Pepco in the meantime. So the first one is institute an integrated distribution system planning process, an IDSP. And that would require Pepco to give a lot more oversight. We would get a lot more oversight. This would create this planning process that would do a lot more valuation. It would do a lot more of the grid planning work that Sarah was talking about, and would really be like a key first step in understanding a lot of the rest of the way that we have to go to municipalization. We also would love to create a distributed energy resource authority. This authority would be another piece of the DC government that actually has control over things like the distributed energy resources that we want to plan to see on our grid, and is a huge step in achieving our climate goals, and then also in making progress towards more affordable rates. Additionally, we would love to change the default electricity supplier. DC has what's known as a deregulated market, which means technically all of us in this room can choose who we are actually buying our electricity supply from. But Pepco is the default, and the average person is not going to go in there and change it. They're not going to go in there to choose something that is maybe cleaner and has a higher portion of renewable energy. And so we'd really like to see, like, we actually have the legislation in DC to be able to change that default, and we would love to see that happen. What other options are there that could serve DC residents better as far as the electricity supply? And then the last thing is that we would love to see some city investment into publicly owned community solar. You may have heard about something called the Build Public Renewables Act that passed a few years ago in New York. This is a huge passage of legislation that DSA was very strongly involved in that is enabling 15 gigawatts of renewable publicly owned renewable energy deployment across the state of New York. And this is huge because it means that once again, there is no profit motive as we are building out these renewables, and all of those benefits can go straight back into New York State. And in our case, it would be going straight back into our community. So this would have huge benefits potentially for low-income residents, especially, and it could be modeled off of DC's existing DC Solar for All program that already runs. So there is a lot of precedent for this, but again, it could be a huge step towards reducing dependence on Pepco and really increasing our power that we have as DC residents over our energy system. Cool. Okay, that is the white paper. You did it. You don't have to read it. Just kidding. So now I would love to welcome up our panelists. We'll take like, a minute or two to shuffle around and get people in their seats.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is John Kwa. I am not in WePower, but this is really lovely to see because I helped with a very large group of people co-found WePower years ago, just as a pledge for candidates not to take money from Pepco Exelon. And now, like years later, it's this coalition putting out white papers, and it's just like, it's really cool to see. Very glad to be here with this panel to talk a little bit more about public power and the movement forward in DC and kind of contextualize this white paper in the space of a movement. We have 3 members of WePower here. We have Matt Saraswini, Harrison Pyros, and Trum DeVries. And we have Sandeep Vaheesan, who is the legal director of the Open Markets Institute and the author of Democracy and Power, A History of Electrification in the US. I will let you each introduce yourself and maybe going this way.
Hey all, I'm Matt. I am, along with Bethany, one of the co-chairs of WePower DC. I've been involved in the chapter and with this campaign specifically for about 4 years now.
Hey everybody, I'm Trum DeVries. I've been involved with WePower since October, and I am one of the community engagement chairs for WePower DC.
Everyone, I'm Sandeep. Thanks so much for having me today and for plugging my book up there. I'm with the Open Markets Institute, which, despite its name, is not a neoliberal Hayekian outfit. It's, I would say, pretty solidly left of center. My book came out last December, and I'm just trying to be of help to public power efforts here in the district and elsewhere. So thanks for having me.
Hi everyone, I'm Harrison Pyros. I'm the communications coordinator for WePower DC.
Great. We will start with some of the WePower members. I'd love to hear a little bit about what the origins of this paper were and why the campaign decided to do this project.
I can start and then you guys can jump in if you like. So you could say that this project has been in the making for many years because we've had a great number of folks contributing to a research team for a number of years. But most proximately, this paper emerged from a planning process that we went through about a year ago, where we were, we were doing some strategic planning as a campaign, and evaluating what we'd accomplished so far, where we wanted to go in the future, and how we were going to get us there. So, and I think also to put this in context, like what we just talked through, what Sarah and Bethany just really beautifully laid out was, understandably, it was really wonky, right? Like it is, I can understand that it can seem a little intimidating, and like, why would we need to produce such a wonky, detailed report? And we made this decision about a year ago when we were doing this planning process, because we realized that we needed to be able to speak the language of legislators, of the more serious players in this game, to get them to understand that this is that these issues are real and that there's a viable alternative, and that it's something that we can do here in DC. And so we decided that, within the broader project, organizing project that we're doing, which I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about, which includes door-to-door canvassing, tabling, a lot of organizing work. We wanted to have a clear and compelling, well-researched case that we could use as a tool when we're talking to legislators, our council members, when we're talking to coalition partners. And so that was the immediate term. Now we want to use that as a legislative tool. And then I think an ancillary point is that hopefully it's useful to other public power campaigns out there to see this as a model.
I guess along those lines, maybe for either of you, what do you think is important for regular people to take away from this report? And what are some of the findings relatedly that surprise you from it?
I think one of the main things that people who aren't, reading the Public Service Commission docket for fun on a Wednesday night, is to really understand how our utility system works and our energy system works, just not in DC, but outside of it in the broader energy market, right? So we can see how a corporation like Pepco and Exelon are, one, calculating our bills and sending us our bills, and two, how they are screwing us over. So it's really important to understand the political sphere of energy politics, financial sphere, and then the climate sphere. And then once you have that understanding, we can work together on how to fix it. I'll give you an example. I want to say about like a year and a half, 2 years ago, people didn't know what PJM interconnection was. And now that data centers are a huge deal and impacting people's daily lives, it's in major publications like Washington Post, New York Times, and more lefty stuff like More Perfect Union. And once people like you and I have that understanding of how that system works, we can collectively come together and fight back.
I'll add one quick thing, which is just that I think the core takeaway that, again, I think Bethany and Sarah explained really well, is that the problems with Pepco are not like unique to Pepco. They are not a result of some, specific greedy people. They're a function. They are fundamental to the model of investor-owned utilities. By their very, foundation, their priority is their shareholders, and everything else is kind of downstream from that. And that's what the white paper explores. It's like all the ways in which that fact creates an energy system that is prioritizing shareholders and moving really slowly on climate action and to make it really expensive for us.
One thing to add, and I also got from Sandeep's book, which is a great book, I do really recommend it, is that something that really changed my thinking with public utilities is that, in a sense, we're paying Pepco to manage something that really should be ours. A lot of ways, lines in a city, the grid in itself is a public good, but we are paying a company to make money off of a public good that we are paying more and more money for. And when you start realizing that the lines in the ground, the electricity that you have is something that you should have, it is a public good, you kind of realize it's insane that a company is making so much money off of something that we naturally should be in control of. And I think that was kind of mind-opening for me.
Some of the proposals in this white paper are incredible, but also probably a long way off, as municipalization generally is. What are some of the steps that y'all would recommend, or you think the city should take, and measures that you think the city should take in the meantime to achieve energy justice?
Well, there's a few that we can do. The first is pretty simple, and that's banning multi-year rate increases. We shouldn't have the cost of delivery service from Pepco go up 5 to 6% a year, year on year. And we should also cap the amount that they can raise the cost of that delivery service. Another smaller things that we can do, well, not smaller, actually, is mandate upfront reporting from Pepco on their assets and on the cost of service. Right now, we don't know how much their assets are actually valued at. And if we don't know how much that substation costs, then we can't essentially check their math, and that directly impacts our rates, right? So as the rate making case and the system acts right now, Pepco can say, hey, it costs $100 million to create that substation. And we as the public go, for real? And they go, yeah. And so that impacts our rates without really a mechanism for us to check it. So transparent reporting would really essentially open Pandora's box when it comes to that kind of sneaky corporate accounting. Another way we can do this is by switching the authority that it controls interconnection and net metering. That is the mechanism that connects your solar and your DERs to the grid, where you can create your own type of energy off of the larger energy market. I personally don't think that should be in Pepco's hands. They've shown that they've been irresponsible about this. It should be in the DC government hands or in DOE's hands. And specifically, when it comes to metering, that's the energy that you're producing from these assets. That's your solar arrays, that's your battery storage. That shouldn't be counted by Pepco because, without mincing words, they lie. And they've been shown to lie. In 2022, there was a few papers that came out that got sued by the AG's office, and they probably continue to lie because they aren't giving specific reporting data on this net metering information to properly credit anybody in this room or anybody listening with solar or with battery storage. So those are a few ways that we can, take control and energy autonomy back to the public sphere. And then finally, when it comes to generating our own electricity, this one's a bit more inoffensive, and I feel like Pepco would honestly agree with us on this one, is we should up the amount that they can bid on clean energy projects in our energy market region. Right now, they just buy from that big PJM interconnection market. They should be able to buy directly from a wind farm or a solar array in what is known as a public power agreement or a PPA that would lock in rates that are low and easy to forecast around. So we won't get these huge price shocks that we're seeing year on year with energy costs going up and up and up. So
overarching there, the point of these reforms that we're advocating for is just to claw back some of the power from Pepco and put it back in the hands of the regulator or the DOE, basically put it back in the hands of the people. So they've got a lot of power to do whatever they want right now in a number of different ways. And we want some of that back. One also really interesting little thing that is unique to DC is the fact that, so Bethany earlier mentioned the fact that we could have a publicly owned solar utility. So a really odd thing about Pepco is that, unlike most investor-owned utilities, Pepco does not have a franchise agreement with the city, meaning they are not the only ones, technically, that are allowed to distribute electricity. So that means that if the city wanted to, the city could create a small competing community solar utility that is, distributing around a neighborhood. There are a lot of interesting things about the fact that we're DC, but that's one thing that's sort of in our favor.
I want to add something, sorry. So I know a lot of the solutions that we're positing are very heady and very technical. Something that a lot of you might have already read that's happening in other states on how to bring power back to the people when it concerns for-profit utilities happened in California, Colorado, Maine, and these places. And that's banning the use of ratepayer money on lobbying expenses, lawyer fees, trade associations, and superfluous expenses. A really dastardly example of this is Virginia Energy across the river. They try to expense their private jet. So essentially, using your guys' ratepayer money to fly their CEO and party. That's something that is really easy for the greater public to understand, and it's a slam dunk when it concerns like centrist and left of center people, especially on the council. We're not the only organization talking about this and drafting legislation around it. There's a few other environmental and affordability organizations in DC that are trying to tee this up and make it a major fight for the next DC Council legislative session. If you guys want to hear more about this, just let me know.
That is a great segue to, whether it's, creating like a local solar utility or banning expenses on jets or whatever it is. What are some, or, passing municipalization, what are some of the challenges that are prohibiting this action on energy justice in DC writ large? Like, what is stopping this from becoming a reality? And maybe how does your organizing fit into that?
Just to be candid, one of the biggest issues that we have is DC home rule. The fact that our home rule is restricted in the district. And that has an impact on a lot of things, as we've seen over the past year, but even before that. For example, for all the bills that are passed in DC Council, there's a congressional review period where Congress can basically overturn it. And we've seen this done. In fact, we've seen it done under Biden. And so that is something that is, we have to look dead in the eye and say, this is a really significant challenge. To step more into the political realm and out of the wonky realm, like if DC was to pass municipalization legislation tomorrow, the extremely unfriendly Congress we have right now would almost certainly overturn it. Pepco and Exelon would get on the phone to their friends and Republican legislators, and they would say, this is awful, that we can't be setting this precedent. This has got to change. So that's another reason why this is a long-term project. We're unfortunately going to need not just a friendly council, but also a federal government that is friendlier than the one we currently have. So that's one big issue that's unique to DC.
We heard a little bit about this earlier, but why can't we achieve these aims of energy justice, whether that's affordability or clean energy goals, just by reforming the existing Public Service Commission?
I'm very jaded when it comes to the PSC, mainly because DC, compared to our counterparts up and down, the East Coast, we have very robust climate laws. We have solar for all, we have community solar, and these programs that are emulated across the country. We put in BEPS, that's the building efficiency codes that decrease our energy uses. And then of course, Pepco clawed that money back. But it doesn't really matter if you have a PSC that doesn't enforce these laws. So we see this especially with how Pepco buys power, mainly from dirty Exelon owned power generating plants. You see this from the reluctance of the chair, Emil Thompson, to not crack down on gas pipes and leaky gas pipes from Washington Gas. It's not enough to just reform who is in the PSC and what the PSC does. It's much easier to then make it a publicly owned government institution. When you have more people that are accountable to the public instead of one or two regulators that you can essentially influence and buy off, it's harder and harder and harder to be corrupt in the public eye.
That makes sense. I'm going to move to Sandeep, who wrote an incredible book on the history of public power in the United States, and hoping to give a little context for how this local campaign fits into the national movement for public power. How common is this form of utility governance, and where do we see it right now?
Probably the single biggest challenge facing public power campaigns right now is the perception that it is untried, unproven, foreign. People are open to the idea, but it feels too experimental. So maybe surprising to some, it's not so much old-fashioned 1950s spread baiting that's preventing the growth of public power. It's a common view that this is something new and novel, and that it's something as fundamental and essential as electricity, we shouldn't be taking a gamble. And so one concrete example I'll mention involves Janet Mills, who is in the news this week, run for senator in Maine. She's the sitting governor. She's served in that role since 2019. And Maine has been trying to undertake a rather audacious expansion of public power. So in 2023, there was a ballot referendum that would take over the two investor-owned utilities in the state, combine them, and turn them into a publicly owned utility. Mills has consistently opposed this, starting in 2021, when the legislature, on a bipartisan basis, actually passed a bill that would have put this question on the ballot in 2021. Mills vetoed it, issued a rather aggressive veto message. And one thing she said is, I'm concerned about turning over our utilities to a publicly owned and operated entity managed by in her words, quote unquote, inexperienced board. And so if we read this message, it sounds like this is something that's never been done. It doesn't really exist in the United States. Why are we taking such a big risk here? And that certainly seemed to be Mills's view of the question. But the reality is that public power is extremely common, as was mentioned earlier. In the United States right now, about 15% of all power customers get their electricity from a publicly owned utility. When you consider their siblings, their first cousins, can debate the relationship between the two rural electric cooperatives, that number jumps to almost 28%. So more than 1 in 4 people in the United States gets their electricity from either a publicly owned or cooperative utility. And some of the places that have public power include the city of Los Angeles, Seattle, Omaha, Nebraska, Jacksonville, Florida, San Antonio, and Austin in Texas. So some large and even very large cities are currently served by municipally owned utilities. This is a proven model. It's existed in many places for over a century. They have low rates, reliable service. So I think that's something we as public power campaigners, public power advocates really need to emphasize. This is proven and time tested. This isn't something novel or experimental. We already do it on a large scale and it works quite well, if not very well.
25% of Americans are over, and for some of those examples, particularly the cities, what are some of the benefits that some of those cities have seen recently in having a public power system, or even the challenges as well?
Yeah, so on average, public power rates are lower than the rates of investor-owned utilities. And the reasons are not hard to divine. They don't have shareholders who are constantly demanding larger dividends, stock buybacks. They often have access to lower cost debt financing. Municipal debt is notably tax exempt. And oftentimes these entities have higher credit ratings than their IOU peers. So that's a very practical benefit. We're talking about rate reductions of anywhere from 10 to 20% if you pursue municipalization or other type of public takeover. I think at a time when affordability is front and center, electricity is seen as an important driver of the affordability crisis, a public power has cachet and appeal that it might not under different circumstances. So I think that's a very practical benefit. One issue that's come up all evening is sort of the power of shareholders. And I think this is something I want to tease out a little bit more. So shareholders are constantly demanding cash from the corporation that they nominally own. It's a very extractive relationship. Shareholders often, or shareholder groups often fashion themselves as investors, and we are investing, we're helping build the infrastructure, we're helping build clean energy. And if you look at the relationship between shareholders and corporations, it's really quite one-sided. Oftentimes, they're not actually contributing anything to investment. People who own shares typically bought it on the secondary market, stocks that were issued years, if not decades ago. So there's no actual investment that's taking place. Companies invest equity. What they're ordinarily doing is they're investing retained earnings, surplus that they've built up. They're not going to the stock market and saying, we propose to raise $2 billion in equity to finance investment X, investment Y. So I think one thing we really need to do is push back against the shareholder mythology that's taken hold in the United States. They're actually supporting productive investment. It's actually quite the opposite. They have a very extractive, if not outright parasitic, relationship with the company they own, whether it's in the power sector or elsewhere. And so I think we can contrast this parasitic relationship with a much more symbiotic public service orientation that comes with public ownership, where the utility is actually set up to serve the public, provide service at just and reasonable rates, prioritize public goals like reaching net zero, ideally earlier than 2050, and providing high quality, well-paying jobs.
We Power and several other groups here are coming from a retreat this last week of public power groups across the country, kind of like part of the burgeoning movement for public power. I'm just thinking about some of these cities and all the places that have public power now. Like, how did, as this movement thinks about how we achieve municipalization, how did they get that in the first place? Like, was there a moment in American history where more of these were set up versus others, or yeah?
Yeah, so there's actually a very long and rich history here. So if you look at the past, let's start with Edison building his small power plant in Pearl Street in New York in 1882. So the early power industry was focused heavily on the largest cities in the United States. That's where they believe they have the most lucrative market. And the practical effect of that was a lot of places were left out. Smaller cities, towns, and so many places realized early on, if we're going to have electricity, we're going to have to do this ourselves. We're going to have to do this through a municipally owned or publicly owned entity. And so some of the publicly owned utilities we have today actually date from the 1880s, the 1890s. And the choice facing these communities was either no service or public provisioning of service. And understandably, many places said, okay, whatever ideological hangups we may have about public ownership, we're going to do this through a publicly owned and operated entity. And so at the turn of the 20th century, you saw an explosion in the number of municipally owned utilities, entities that served places that didn't have electricity, and increasingly places that did have electricity from investor-owned utilities, but were unhappy with the quality of service, frequent outages, long outages, and of course, high rates. And so you started to see more of a relationship defined by tension, if not outright conflict, between public and private, where a number of cities said, enough is enough. Investor-owned utilities are not providing the service that they promised to deliver. Let's just take them over and do this ourselves. Remove the profit motive, provide service at cost. And so if you look at the numbers in the late 19th century, early 20th century, hundreds of municipally owned utilities were formed in a relatively short period of time. So that was one period in which we saw an explosion in public ownership. The second period was in the 1930s during the New Deal. And we can talk about rural electrification if people are interested, but I'm going to focus on cities. This was a time when you had a federal government that was, in many ways, the antithesis of the government we have right now. They were actively supportive of public ownership. They actually put their thumb on the scale in favor of public ownership. So I'll highlight two things that they did. So first, the federal government said that we have millions of people out of work right now. We need to put them back to work, ideally doing socially beneficial things. So an agency by the name of the Public Works Administration actually told local governments, if you want to build a competitive power system, we will provide you low-cost loans and even grants to build those systems. So far cry from the government we have today. Cheap financing to build competitive, publicly owned utilities, in a sense to discipline the investor-owned utilities that they currently had. So that was one example. The second example of the federal government putting its thumb on the scale was federal government built large hydroelectric projects across the country, famously in the Tennessee Valley in the southeast and the Columbia River in the Pacific Northwest. And what the government did in setting up these institutions, it said publicly owned and cooperative utilities are going to have first dibs on this low-cost electricity. So if you set up a municipally owned utility, you will have access to all this low-cost hydropower. If you stick with your existing IOU, you won't have access to this electricity. So these are examples of federal government actively supporting public ownership. And so you saw a second wave of public ownership. You saw hundreds of publicly owned utilities being formed in the 1930s and 1940s. And so these are really the two periods in American history where public ownership in the power sector expanded on a large scale. And ever since the 40s, we've largely been trying to defend what we have now, prevent privatization, and we've mostly held off privatization. There have been relatively few instances of publicly owned or cooperative utilities being privatized. Even though we've lived in an era of neoliberalism over the past 50 years, the institutions we've had largely managed to stay in place. And so I'll sort of offer an optimistic note here. I think in many ways we see parallels between the 2020s and the 1920s, a time of growing reaction, white supremacy. But a lot of the organizing and advocacy work that laid the foundation for the New Deal was done during the 1920s, the period of conservatism. And so I'd like to believe, the work that's being done by WePower is laying the groundwork for a 21st century New Deal, which we call it a Green New Deal. It's not that we're expecting to get short-term wins. We're not expecting to expand public power on a large scale this year or even next, but perhaps we're laying the foundation stones for doing it in a big way in 2029 or 2030.
That makes sense. And I think you spoke to the federal government's involvement in the rollout of public power authorities. Right now we're watching the rollback of the only congressional action we've ever taken on climate as a country. How do public power authorities compare to investor-owned utilities in terms of the transition to clean energy or transition in our electricity to clean energy?
The answer to this question is it depends. So if you look at publicly owned utilities in the Pacific Northwest, they're almost 100% carbon free. The reason for that is not surprising. The federal government built large hydroelectric projects. The Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River is still actually the largest power plant in the United States. They have preferential access to this electricity. So if you're looking at Seattle City Light or Eugene Water and Electric Board, which serves Eugene, Oregon, they're almost 100% carbon free or 90% carbon free. And that's a benefit of geography, benefit of large scale federal investment in that region in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. If we look elsewhere, the record is much more complicated. In some instances, POUs, publicly owned utilities, are less clean than IOUs. And one common refrain I've seen, if you listen to the Bulls podcast or read Heat Map, they're very middle of the road outlets and voices, they might say, quit focusing so much on ownership. It's a distraction. look at the records, on average, they're about the same as IOUs, or in some cases, lagging IOUs. As I'll say, like, ownership is a distraction. Don't focus on it. We need to focus on climate, 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 climate. You know, there's merit to that point. Climate change is a global existential threat. We have to take it seriously. But how we do it matters. The pace at which we do it matters. And my view is it's not so much that public ownership today is delivering rapid decarbonization. Truthfully, it isn't, but it can. I think VPRA is a testament to that. The Build Public Renewables Act in New York Power Authority has already said they're going to build 7 gigawatts of zero carbon capacity and storage. You know, they're not exactly enthusiastic about this new authority. Justin Driscoll, the president of NYPA, is self-identified Republican. I don't think he wanted this responsibility, but thanks to organizing by DSA and climate-minded legislators, I think he's being pressured to do the right thing. So I think a public approach can actually accelerate the climate transition. And we've made progress. You know, we have more wind and solar than we did 20 years ago, but we still get about 60% of our power generation from coal and natural gas. And the number was 73% in 2003. So if you look at the progress we've made over the past two decades, it's there, but it's not nearly fast enough. And I'll actually offer a quote from a rather unfortunate op-ed that was published in the New York Times in December. That many of you may have seen this op-ed. The title was "Climate Activists Need to Radically Change Their Approach Under Trump." And this op-ed offered this sort of triumphalist, almost end of history view of climate policy. Like, the IRA was the last word. We have fought the big fights. The fights going forward are going to be much more technocratic. And I mean, I found this op-ed maddening at the time, but it's aged incredibly poorly. So, so the last paragraph says, this approach might seem overly accommodating to the industries that are causing climate change, but the legislation of the Biden era demonstrates that pragmatism produces better results than dogmatism. As we look toward an uncertain political future, one lesson is clear: the path to lasting climate progress lies not in oil and gas antagonism, but in transforming our opponents into stakeholders in a clean energy future. We all know the Inflation Reduction Act was blown up over the summer. It exists, I would say, in name only. The money, the federal support for wind and solar is going to dry up very soon. So my view is this view is fundamentally wrong-headed. The IRA didn't even last until its third birthday in its original form. And you know, the author of this op-ed might want to look in the mirror and say, what did I get wrong? And I think what he got wrong was the IRA never actually had popular buy-in. It didn't have red state or Republican buy-in. And I think one real virtue of public power is that it can actually advance multiple objectives at once. It can improve reliability, improve affordability, and then it can also accelerate the climate transition. And so in some ways, a silver lining of the death of the IRA is I think it'll force people, you know, not just people in this room, but more middle of the road people to say, what do we do to make this stick? How do we ensure that the next big climate bill isn't repealed as soon as the other side takes power? And if you look at the history of public power institutions in this country, they've been extraordinarily durable. You know, the Tennessee Valley Authority is going to reach 100 years in age in 2033. So today it's 92 years old. And you know, there have been tremendous political changes over the past 9 decades. We've had extremely right-wing governments. Even before Trump, we had Reagan. We've had extremely conservative Congresses. Think about the Gingrich Congress in the mid-90s. And this institution has survived all of that. So I think that's a powerful fact in our favor. Public power is durable, enduring, and sticky in a good way that tax credits and the de-risking approach that's been in vogue simply isn't.
I have just one more question for you, but I'm going to pull in y'all as well. You brought up the BPRA in New York and the fight in Maine, and I actually got to work with the organizers on both. And a sort of like core part of both those fights was the labor movement and unions support or eventual opposition. In some cases, Maine supported state legislation, ended up opposing the ballot initiative. And there's an interesting story there, right? New York, they had the backing of labor unions through it. How has labor shown up in the fight for public power? Like, what is at stake for that? And similarly, in the DC context, we saw some of the slides earlier, like what is at stake for labor in this fight here in DC? And are they sort of showing up for these efforts in that way.
Organized labor has never been a central part of the fight for public power. When I started working on my book in 2020, one of my sort of operating hypotheses was labor must have played a big role. Like most progressive advances in this country have featured labor front and center. They are the institutional heft behind left politics. I don't think that's too much of an overstatement. But if you look at public power historically and today, organized labor has either been neutral or hostile. And I'll focus on the present. So the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, the main union in the power sector, has some, how should I say, historical institutional baggage. It's one of these old craft unions. It comes out of the AFL. It often brings a very insular, parochial approach to its issues. It cares about its members, obviously very important, but it doesn't really bring a more global universalist approach. It doesn't purport to speak for the broader working class. It speaks for its members. It cares about good CBAs. That's very important. I don't mean to discount that, but it doesn't really think more holistically or socially. It's not like UAW under Sean Fane. It's really quite the opposite. So its view is, we stand to lose if our employer, an investor-owned utility, is taken into public hands. And right now, it is better to be a unionized private sector worker than it is to be a unionized public sector worker. The law is generally better for private sector workers. So if you're a public sector worker, you may not be able to strike, you may not be able to collect dues from your members. The law is worse. I mean, the IBEW does have a point here, but the law isn't static. It can be changed. We can fix public sector labor law. And I think it's really critical to show electrical sector workers that in the long run, public ownership is not just better for the community that utility serves, but it's better for the workers themselves. Publicly owned utility doesn't face the constant demands and pressures from shareholders. And I don't think I'm overstating things, but shareholders and workers often have an antagonistic relationship. Stock buybacks and dividends often come at the expense of high wages and good benefits. And so things may be okay today, but we should also take a longer term perspective, especially as utilities come under private equity ownership. The conflicts between shareholders and workers are only going to become more acute. So under public ownership, we can actually have a much more harmonious relationship. We can prioritize good wages, good benefits. We can get out of this trap trying to cut costs by contracting out work, which is a serious problem with Pepco. So I think we do have a compelling sales pitch for workers at utility, but the political fight's not going to be easy. Their union has, for the most part, been against public ownership, and they've been socialized to think of public ownership as a bad thing. So I think we can persuade them to come over to our side, but it's going to take real work, real public education on our parts.
Yeah, and to add some to that, it's very interesting when you look at IBEW and the UWUA. What was mentioned earlier by Bethany is that losing the right to strike when you become a public utility, public employees is a really big deal for them. It's essentially defanging them in their ability to really hold strong during negotiations. But if you look at the case in New York, there were two different public power cases. When it went to IBEW dealing with the New York Power Authority, they came out and said, well, in the past, because they have both public and private representation, in the past, we've had a better time negotiating with the private utility than we have the public utility. And in that case, it was actually other unions that were brought on board. The teachers union, service workers union, hospital union, they came on board to support public power because they saw it as very important. But a really great model for us, because just like Sandeep said, there are many ways to do this, and there's many ways to get union support. LIPA in Long Island, they did a number of things. Like first, they guaranteed that right to strike, which was said earlier. But they also guaranteed that the IBEW would have a seat on their board, on the actual governing board of the union, which is something that's very important because, as Sandeep was talking about earlier, public power, there are multiple different types of public utilities. And the way that we set up our public utility is going to be very important. And if we do it in a way where we're approaching the union early on, we're trying to get labor support, and we're really emphasizing that we're not just trying to pull you in, but we want you to be in the driving seat with us, because unions are utilities are very important hiring mechanisms within a community. They provide thousands of jobs. There are 1,400 Pepco employees right now, and only 900 of them are IBEW employees. So if we look at models of successful negotiations with the union, we can really build something that's great and get the union on board. It just, like Sandeep said, they tend to be a more institutional union. They might take a little negotiation, but that's something we look forward to doing with them.
Would the utility board or management be appointed directly by the DC government, or would customers and employees have some sort of say, like kind of like a credit union?
With most public utilities across the US right now, it operates as a department of the city. So if we're thinking of like Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, so these are people that have some internal hiring. You're looking for experts in these fields. Oftentimes you're hiring from within the organization. So people who were linemen and then became managers, X, Y, and Z. And then for heads of department, you have, if the public power utility exists as part of the city and not as a department, it would be appointed by the mayor because it would almost be like a cabinet position.
Harrison's right, but I'll add that a minority of publicly owned utilities have elected boards. Typically, they're separate entities, they're independent from the municipal government, and they're elected by the customers they serve. So Eugene Water and Electric Board, Omaha Public Power District, Sacramento Municipal Utility District, which has the fun acronym SMUD. They all have elected boards. They have been elected for a long time. And I think one very practical benefit of having worker representation on the board, you could imagine some sort of governance co-determination arrangement would be that the workers would not only have a say in how the enterprise is run, but they'd also bring real expertise to utility systems. They know the ins and outs of keeping the lights on. So, Janet Mills talked about the threat of having a utility run by an inexperienced board. But one way to address that is have worker representation that allows for informed decision making.
They also use the servant. So you're not getting, leadership from some shareholder in Chicago. You're getting somebody who uses the Pepco service.
Thank you both. Hey, you're at time. This was really helpful, but I want to close out by asking y'all just released this awesome white paper. There are next steps in the campaign. We'd love to hear what happens next with the campaign and how people can get involved.
Absolutely. So, as I said earlier, we understand that what we've talked through tonight is complex and wonky and can be difficult to approach for folks who don't know much about energy. But that should not be a barrier to you getting involved in this fight, because at its core, this is a political and an organizing issue, just as much, if not more, than it is a technical issue, right? Like, this is something that it's a project that is going to take a lot of people filling all sorts of different roles in this fight. So we focused tonight on the really technical part, but that is one part of a broad political strategy that has to be undertaken to fight for better living conditions for us all, right? Cheaper electricity, moving away from fossil fuels. So on that note, there are a lot of ways that folks can get involved. We would love folks to join our meetings that we have biweekly. More concretely, we've been going out and wheat pasting, putting up posters. We've been doing door-to-door canvassing. We've been tabling. We have a public power pledge that you will find on our website. You'll find it right on the table there. There's a QR code with it. What we want to be able to do, along with demonstrating that we have the policy chops and we know what we're talking about, we also want to show that a lot of people in DC are behind this. They are sick of Pepco and they want something different. And so the sort of organizing project that is happening is getting a lot of sign-ons to the Public Power Pledge and being able to demonstrate, and then going to legislators, being able to demonstrate people are really sick of Pepco. We need to do everything we can to rein them in. So there's a long-winded way of saying we've got tabling, we've got door-to-door canvassing, we've got just putting up posters, we've got just talking to people about the importance of public power. But we would really love it if you filled out the Public Power Pledge and maybe came to a meeting and helped us out, because we've got a long road ahead and a lot of work to do.